Officer Daniel Miller never imagined his Tuesday shift would redefine his entire career. He'd walked this same polished concourse at Gate C of the International Terminal thousands of times, the rhythmic click of his K9 partner's nails on the linoleum a steady, comforting beat against the anxious hum of travel. Max, a Belgian Malinois with a coat the color of burnt gold and a service record as clean as the sterile air, was more than a partner. He was an extension of Miller's own senses, a finely tuned instrument of law and order. The battered, slate-gray suitcase that trundled off the carousel from Flight 714, originating from Bogotá, looked utterly ordinary, just another piece of luggage worn down by 1,000 indifferent journeys. But as Max made his pass, his behavior shifted from focused professionalism to something Miller had never witnessed. The dog, who could detect a microgram of cocaine through a vacuum-sealed wall of coffee grounds, refused to even approach it. Miller initially assumed the dog was having a rare off day, perhaps distracted by a scent trail left by a passenger's pet. But a faint, almost imperceptible detail, a slight vibration he could feel through the soles of his boots whenever the suitcase shuddered to a stop, hinted at a truth far stranger than any contraband. What Max was trying to tell him had nothing to do with crime, and everything to do with a life hanging by a thread. This was not a story about procedure or protocol. It was a story about an instinct so pure it defied training, a loyalty that broke every rule to uphold a higher law. If you believe in the unspoken language that connects a man and his dog, you'll want to see this through to the end. The discovery they were about to make would leave every officer in the room frozen in a silence so profound, it would echo in their careers for years to come. The baggage carousel whirred with a monotonous efficiency, spitting out a kaleidoscope of luggage onto the stainless steel track. Backpacks, hardshell rollers, duffel bags straining at their zippers, a parade of personal worlds, each a potential secret. For Max, this was the workspace, the field of play. Miller gave the familiar, low command, "Seek." The dog's body language transformed. His ears swiveled forward, his posture lowered slightly, and his tail, usually a relaxed plume, straightened with purpose. He began his methodical sweep, his wet nose hovering inches above each piece of luggage, a living, breathing scanner processing trillions of scent molecules per second. He was a professional, a prodigy of his breed. He cleared a bright pink roller, a massive olive drab duffel, a set of matched leather bags. His movements were fluid, economical, a dance of duty. Then he reached the grey suitcase. It was nondescript, scarred with the history of its travels, a faded airline tag from a long-defunct carrier still clinging to its handle. Max, who was moving with the confident momentum of his search, abruptly halted. His forward motion ceased so suddenly that his back paws skidded slightly on the polished floor. He didn't alert. He didn't sit or paw at the bag, the trained indications for a positive hit. Instead, he did something far more alarming, he recoiled. A low whine, a sound of distress Miller usually only heard during the dog's annual vet checkups, escaped his throat. Max took a half step back, his head cocked, his ears pinned not in aggression, but in what looked like confusion, or even fear. Miller felt a prickle of unease. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble meant only for his partner. He gave a gentle tug on the lead. "Seek." "Go on," Max resisted. He planted his paws, the muscles in his powerful haunches tense. He looked up at Miller, his intelligent brown eyes wide with an appeal that transcended species. It was a clear, desperate message, no. The carousel continued its indifferent rotation, bringing the grey suitcase around again. Miller's jaw tightened. He felt a flush of heat crawl up his neck. A K9 officer's reputation was inextricably linked to his dog's performance. A refusal to work, especially in a high-traffic, public area, was more than an anomaly, it was a professional failing. Across the hall, he saw his direct supervisor, Sergeant Peterson, a man who viewed the world through the rigid lens of a procedural manual, watching them. Beside him stood Officer Davies, younger, ambitious, and known for his thinly veiled opinion that the K9 unit was an expensive and theatrical relic. Davies caught Miller's eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible smirk. The humiliation was a physical weight. "Max, seek," Miller commanded, his voice firmer this time, laced with an authority he didn't feel. He pulled more insistently on the lead, forcing the dog closer to the offending bag. Max's reaction was even more pronounced. He whined louder, a high, keening sound of pure anxiety. He actively pulled away, his body trembling. He wasn't being disobedient, he was communicating something urgent and profound, but the language was foreign, maddeningly obscure. "What in God's name is wrong with him?" Davis' voice cut through the air as he and Peterson strode over. "He having a sick day, Miller." Peterson, a stern man with a face carved from granite, ignored the jibe and addressed Miller directly. "What's the issue, officer?" "I don't know, Sarge," Miller admitted, his frustration mounting. "He's refusing the search on this one bag." Peterson's eyes narrowed, first at the trembling dog, then at the unremarkable suitcase. "Is he ill? Did he eat something this morning?" "No, sir. He was perfect on the cargo sweep less than an hour ago. He's just refusing this 1-inch." Davies chimed in, unable to resist. "Maybe the Bogota cartel finally invented a smell-proof bag. Or maybe the dog's just broken." Miller shot him a glare. "He's not broken." He knelt, running a hand down Max's back. The dog was vibrating with a strange energy. It wasn't the excited tremor of a potential find, it was the frequency of fear. Miller's training, his years of experience, screamed at him that this was a problem with the dog. But his gut, the deep, instinctual bond he'd forged with Max over 4 years of shared danger and quiet companionship, told him the problem was with the bag. The dog wasn't failing, he was trying to tell him something vital, and Miller was failing to understand. They pulled the suitcase from the carousel. The owner, according to the manifest, was a man named Carlos Rodriguez, but as the last of the passengers from Flight 714 cleared customs, no one came to claim it. The bag sat alone under the harsh fluorescent lights of the secondary screening area, an orphan of international travel. It was a standard-issue fabric suitcase, the kind you could buy at any department store, but up close, it looked tired. The corners were frayed, and a dark, ambiguous stain marred one side. Sergeant Peterson circled it like a shark. "All right, Miller. One more time. No distractions. Just the dog and the bag." The sterile quiet of the screening room amplified the tension. Miller unclipped Max's lead, a gesture of trust. "Okay, boy," he whispered, his voice soft, coaxing. "Just one more look. Easy now. What is it?" He gestured toward the suitcase. Max approached it cautiously, his body low to the ground. He didn't use his nose. Instead, he did something that sent a chill down Miller's spine. He lowered his head and pressed his ear against the fabric side of the suitcase, his entire body rigid and listening. He held the position for a long, silent moment, then backed away, a low growl rumbling in his chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but of profound unease. He then walked directly to Miller, nudged his head insistently against his handler's hand, and whined, looking from Miller's face to the bag and back again. The message was suddenly, shockingly clear. He wasn't telling Miller what was in the bag. He was telling Miller to listen. "He wants me to listen to it," Miller said, the words feeling foolish as he spoke them. Davies let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Oh, come on. Now the dog is a psychic." But Peterson silenced him with a sharp look. He was a man of procedure, but he had also seen enough strange things in his 30 years on the force to not dismiss everything outright. Miller, ignoring Davies, knelt beside the suitcase. He felt the cold, smooth fabric under his palm. He pressed his own ear to the spot Max had indicated. The hum of the building's ventilation, the distant chime of an airport announcement, the blood rushing in his own ears. Nothing. He held his breath, concentrating, trying to filter out the noise. And then he heard it. Faint, rhythmic, delicate. Thump. 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 It was so soft he thought he was imagining it, a phantom echo of his own anxious heartbeat. He pulled back, shaking his head. I'm not sure. I think I hear something, but it could be anything. A mechanism, a clock, a timer, Peterson finished, his voice grim. The word hung in the air, changing the entire dynamic of the situation. AK-9 refusing to approach could mean a chemical agent designed to deter bomb dogs. A faint, rhythmic sound could mean a detonator. The protocol for this was clear and terrifying. The atmosphere in the room shifted from professional curiosity to cold, sharp-edged fear. A potential explosive device, especially one a dog refused to sniff, was the highest level of threat. Protocol dictated a complete lockdown of the area and an immediate call to the bomb squad. Peterson was already reaching for his radio. I'm calling it in, he said, his voice clipped and all business. But Miller didn't move. He stood, his gaze fixed on the suitcase, his mind racing. It didn't feel right. Max's reaction wasn't the one he'd been trained to associate with explosives. Dogs trained for bomb detection are often conditioned to react with passive excitement, to sit calmly to indicate a find, ensuring they don't disturb a potentially unstable device. Max's behavior was the opposite. It was anxious, protective, and deeply, personally distressed. And the sound, it wasn't the precise, mechanical ticking of a clock. It was softer, more organic. More alive. Wait, Miller said, the word coming out louder than he intended. Peterson paused, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. Wait for what, Miller? For it to go off. It's not a bomb, Miller stated, the certainty of the conviction surprising even himself. I don't think it is, Davies scoffed. And you know this how? Because your dog is having a panic attack. Because my dog is trying to tell me something else, Miller shot back, his eyes locking with Peterson's. His reaction is wrong for explosives. It's all wrong. He's scared, Sarge. Not for himself, I don't think. He's scared for whatever is in there. He took a step closer to the bag, his every instinct screaming at him. He was potentially breaking every rule in the book, risking his career and the safety of everyone in the room on a gut feeling, on the desperate, silent plea in his partner's eyes. X-ray is the next step, Peterson said, his voice a low growl of waning patience. Let's get it in the scanner and see what we are dealing with. No, Miller said, more forcefully. If I'm right, and there's something alive in there, the radiation could harm it. Let me open it. The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. Davies looked at Miller as if he'd lost his mind. Opening a suspect package that AK-9 had refused was an act of such profound procedural insanity that it was career suicide. Peterson stared at Miller, his expression unreadable. He saw a damn good officer, a man he had mentored, standing on the precipice of a catastrophic error in judgment. But he also saw the unshakable conviction in Miller's eyes, a conviction born from the sacred trust between a handler and his K9. He weighed the manual against the man. After a lifetime of choosing the manual, he made a different choice. You have 2 minutes, Miller, Peterson said, his voice dangerously quiet. Get the bolt cutters. This is on you. The walk to the maintenance closet to retrieve the bolt cutters felt a mile long. Every eye in the security hub followed Miller. He could feel their judgment, their pity, their morbid curiosity. He was the officer who'd cracked, the one who was trusting a spooked dog over years of training and common sense. When he returned, the small screening room felt like an operating theater. Peterson had cleared everyone out except for Davies, who stood by the door, arms crossed, a vulture waiting for the spectacle to unfold. Max was whining softly just outside the closed door, a heartbreaking sound of frustrated loyalty. Miller placed the heavy iron jaws of the cutters around the cheap metal loop documentos of the first zipper lock. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the server rack in the corner, and Miller's own ragged breathing. He squeezed the handles. The metal shrieked and then snapped with a crack that made Davies jump. One lock down. He moved to the second. His hands were slick with sweat. He was acutely aware of what he was risking. If this was a bomb, he would be a fine red mist in seconds. If it was a new kind of narcotic, he'd look like a paranoid fool. He squeezed again. Snap! The second lock broke free. The suitcase was now unsecured. He paused, his heart hammering against his ribs. He thought he heard the faint thumping sound again, or maybe it was just the echo of his own pulse. He took a deep, steadying breath, placed his hands on either side of the lid, and lifted. The lid came up smoothly, silently. Miller, Peterson, and Davies all leaned in, their bodies tensed, their minds braced for the sight of wires, timers, or bricks of contraband. What they saw instead shattered their expectations into a million pieces. For a long, breathless moment, no one spoke. No one moved. They just stared, frozen in a collective state of silent, horrified shock. The air, once thick with tension, was now heavy with a sudden, devastating sadness. The scene inside the suitcase was a tableau of quiet, desperate suffering. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't a product. It was a life. Inside, nestled in a tangle of filthy, threadbare rags, was a dog. A pit bull, its fawn-colored coat matted and stained, its body so skeletal that every rib and vertebra stood out in sharp, tragic relief. Its head was too large for its emaciated frame, and its eyes, when they slowly blinked open, were cloudy with confusion and exhaustion. The dog was alive, but only just. A single, crudely punched hole in the side of the suitcase, no bigger than a quarter, was its only source of air, a tiny portal to a world that had tried to suffocate it. The air that escaped the bag was foul, a testament to days of confinement and fear. The rhythmic thumping sound that Miller had barely detected, the sound Max had keyed in on with such urgency, was now obvious. It was the dog's tail. Too weak to lift, it was feebly, almost unconsciously, thumping against the padded side of the suitcase. A ghost of a wag. A spark of hope refusing to be extinguished in the suffocating darkness. Davies, the cynic, let out a choked sound, a half-swallowed gasp of horror. Peterson, the stoic sergeant, simply closed his eyes for a moment, his stony facade cracking to reveal the man beneath. Miller felt a wave of emotions so powerful it almost brought him to his knees, rage at the cruelty, a profound, aching sorrow for the creature's suffering, and an overwhelming surge of validation for his partner. Max hadn't been refusing a command. He had been refusing to allow this atrocity to be treated as a piece of evidence. He hadn't been detecting a crime, he had been detecting a victim. The K-9 wasn't afraid of the bag, he was afraid for the being trapped inside it. His anxiety, his whining, his desperate pleas, it was all a frantic attempt to communicate the presence of another dog, one who was helpless, terrified, and dying. Miller's professional world tilted on its axis. He had been trained to see the world in black and white, threat and non-threat. But Max saw it in shades of life and suffering. The spell of shocked silence broke. The room, once a stage for suspense, instantly became a triage center. The objective shifted from investigation to salvation. Miller's training as an officer, the rigid discipline and emotional distance, melted away, replaced by a raw, human instinct to protect and to comfort. "Get a vet," he said, his voice thick with emotion but steady with newfound purpose. Now Davies, his earlier cynicism completely evaporated, was already on his radio, his voice urgent, as he requested animal control and the nearest emergency veterinary contact. Peterson was coordinating, securing the area not as a crime scene, but as a rescue zone. Miller knelt, his movements slow and gentle, not wanting to frighten the terrified animal. "Hey there," he whispered, his voice a low, soothing murmur. "It's okay. It's okay now. We've got you. He reached in, not to seize or control, but to offer a lifeline. His fingers brushed against the dog's fur, and he could feel the life, fragile and fluttering, beneath the skin. The dog flinched, but didn't have the energy to recoil. Miller carefully, tenderly, gathered the animal into his arms. It was shockingly light, weighing no more than a child's toy. The dog let out a faint, pitiful whimper, a sound of pain and fear that cut Miller to the core. He lifted her out of her fabric prison and cradled her against his chest. She was shivering, either from cold or from shock. Without a second thought, Miller unzipped his own uniform jacket and wrapped it around her frail body, cocooning her in its warmth. The other officers watched, their faces a mixture of horror at the cruelty and awe at the quiet tenderness of the scene. When the door opened, Max pushed his way in, his nails clicking anxiously on the floor. He stopped short, his intelligent eyes taking in the scene. He saw Miller holding the strange, trembling bundle. There was no aggression, no territorial growling. He approached slowly, lowered his head, and gave the rescued dog a single, gentle sniff. It was a gesture of welcome, of acknowledgement. A silent communication between three souls in a sterile airport room, the rescuer, the rescued, and the hero, who had refused to be silent. The journey to the Northwood Emergency Veterinary Clinic was a blur of flashing lights and quiet prayers. Miller rode in the back of the animal control van, refusing to leave the dog's side. He held her cradled in his jacket, her small, weak body a fragile weight against his chest. He could feel the faint, fluttery beat of her heart and whispered to her the whole way, making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Just hold on. You're safe now. Don't you give up. At the clinic, a team was waiting. They rushed her into the trauma unit, and Miller was left standing in the antiseptic-smelling waiting room, the empty space in his arms feeling colder and heavier than when he had been holding her. The initial prognosis was grim. Severe dehydration, advanced starvation, muscle atrophy. The vet, a compassionate woman named Dr. Aries, told him the dog, a female pit bull mix approximately 2 years old, was lucky to be alive. She had likely been in that suitcase for days. They started her on 4 fluids and nutrients, her tiny body hooked up to a web of tubes and monitors. Miller stayed. He finished his shift, then called his captain and explained he was taking personal leave. He sat in a chair beside her kennel, watching the slow, steady drip of the 4-bag, a lifeline measuring out hope in tiny increments. He decided to name her. It felt important, a way to reclaim her from the anonymous cruelty she had endured. He called her Hope. For the next 3 days, Miller's life revolved around that clinic. He would go home only to feed Max and sleep for a few fitful hours before returning. Sergeant Peterson had quashed any internal investigation into Miller's procedural breach, listing the incident in the official report as a K-9 assisted welfare check. Davies had even called to ask how Hope was doing. The incident had sent a ripple of change through the department. On the 3rd day, Miller brought Max with him. The vet allowed it, curious to see the interaction. Max entered the quiet room, walked directly to Hope's kennel, and lay down, his nose just inches from the bars, keeping a silent, patient vigil. Later that afternoon, a miracle. Hope lifted her head and lapped water from a bowl on her own. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. The next day, she stood, her legs wobbly and unsure, but she stood. Miller was there, his hand on her back, steadying her. He felt a tear trace a path down his cheek, and didn't bother to wipe it away. Over the next week, Hope's recovery was a slow but steady climb. The light returned to her eyes. She started to gain weight. The first time she wagged her tail with real energy, a full, sweeping motion that shook her whole body, the entire clinic staff cheered. And her bond with Miller and Max solidified into something fierce and beautiful. She would press her head into Miller's hand, her trust absolute. She would greet Max with a gentle lick on the nose. They were a pack, forged in the crucible of a dark, lonely suitcase. Months later, the chill of the airport security room was a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of a sun-drenched living room. Hope, no longer a skeletal victim but a glossy, muscular dog, chased a worn tennis ball across a green lawn, her movements powerful and joyful. Max, retired from duty a few months after the incident, watched her with the calm, proprietary air of an older brother. Officer Miller, now just Dan to his two dogs, sat on his porch steps, a cup of coffee in his hands, and watched them play. He had officially adopted Hope as soon as she was medically cleared. The investigation to find Carlos Rodriguez, the name on the luggage tag, had hit a dead end. The identity was a fake, the trail cold. The cruelty remained anonymous, a faceless evil. But the good that had come from it was here, wrestling playfully in his backyard. The incident had changed him in ways he was still discovering. The rigid certainty of his job had been replaced by a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the world. He had been a good cop, a man who followed the rules to the letter. But Max had taught him that some rules needed to be broken, that true justice is sometimes found not in a manual, but in an act of radical compassion. He looked at Max, now dozing in a patch of sun. The dog wasn't a tool or a weapon. He was a partner, a being with a moral compass so true it had guided them all to this moment of peace. What began as a moment of professional humiliation, a tense confrontation over a suspicious suitcase, had become the single most important event of his life. It was his greatest failure as a by-the-book officer, and his greatest triumph as a human being. He finally understood what Max had been trying to say in that sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway. He wasn't refusing a command. He was refusing to treat a life as cargo. He was refusing to let another soul suffer alone in the dark. In a world of noise and confusion, Max had listened to the faintest whisper of a heartbeat, and had refused to ignore it. The ultimate lesson was simple, yet profound. The most important voices are often the ones that cannot speak, and the greatest courage is found not in facing down threats, but in bending down to offer help. Sometimes, the most heroic thing you can do is listen.